Starting in January 2028, production of physical discs will stop for every new game released on PlayStation consoles. Existing games and titles scheduled for disc release before that deadline are unaffected by this new policy. Nobody is claiming Sony will enter your home, melt your collection, or disable the disk drive beneath your television. What changes is the future, because every new PlayStation game after the cutoff becomes digital only instead of offering both formats. Today we are testing Sony's consumer choice argument with its sales figures, legal terms, retailer wording, and old store closures. First, we need to establish how many players still buy physical games. Second, we need to explain what disappears when a disc becomes an account-bound license. Third, we need to separate confirmed policy from speculation about whatever PlayStation hardware comes next. Worse, Sony announced this digital-only future on the same day it confirmed that digital stores from its past are closing. According to Sony's latest financial report, digital downloads represented 78% of full game software units across PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 during fiscal year 2025. During the final quarter, that digital share climbed even higher to 85%. Across the entire year, Sony recorded about 318 million full game software units. Roughly 22% were not digital downloads, which works out to almost 70 million full game units. Astoundingly, that remaining volume is now being treated like an outdated inconvenience instead of a serious market. Crucially, Sony did not report 70 million individual buyers, and its total includes bundled software, but the remaining volume was still substantial. By ending the format across all new games, Sony is not merely following demand, it is setting the only acceptable route for future purchases. That difference matters because consumer preference describes what people choose when alternatives exist, while compulsion describes what remains after the alternatives are removed. Measured against the total, physical gaming is clearly the minority. Regardless, almost 70 million non-digital units are still too large to dismiss as irrelevant. More importantly, physical purchases provide practical freedoms rather than decorative plastic. Physical buyers are not 12 collectors hiding in a basement while everyone else celebrates digital permission slips. Collectors buy discs because the object, artwork, visible library, and long-term access matter to them. Families use physical copies because one game can move between siblings, relatives' rooms, and compatible consoles. Bargain hunters compare stores, wait for clearance discounts, buy used copies, and trade completed titles toward another purchase. Rural customers may prefer discs because enormous downloads can be slow, unreliable, or restricted by expensive data limits. Resellers recover part of a game's cost after finishing it, making full-price releases easier to justify. Now ask the obvious question, does choosing digital more often mean asking Sony to remove the alternative completely? Choosing self-checkout does not mean shoppers demanded the removal of every cashier. Convenience explains why people download games, but convenience never required PlayStation to make that method compulsory. Corporate logic takes a popular option, destroys the competing option, then announces that customers designed the result. Here is the translation: most players chose digital, so every player will now receive digital whether they like it or not. Popularity explains the business decision, but it does not make the decision consumer-friendly. Business advantages are obvious because digital distribution gives Sony and publishers tighter control over prices, access, and transactions. Consumer advantages look weaker once the same system becomes mandatory for every new game. Meanwhile, customers receive convenience they already had while surrendering options they could previously use. Instead of improving digital value enough to win every sale, Sony can simply stop producing the competing format. Boxed games create a second market that the original publisher cannot completely control after the first sale. Owners can lend them, trade them, import them, sell them online, or pass them through a family. Downloaded licenses normally remain tied to the purchasing account instead of becoming another person's cheaper copy. Publishers earn nothing when a used disc changes hands, so eliminating discs also eliminates that unwanted escape route. For publishers, the policy also reduces manufacturing risk, shipping costs, unsold stock, retailer returns, and the awkward problem of customers waiting for used prices. GameStop loses resale stock when new games never arrive on disc in the first place. Retailers will apparently remain involved because Sony says future games will still be available through stores in digital formats. However, Sony has not explained whether that means download cards, boxed codes, account codes, or another retail system. Therefore, claiming that Sony officially confirmed a total PlayStation Store monopoly would be inaccurate. Still, Removing discs weakens several forms of competition, even if several checkout counters remain. Future disc clearance sales largely disappear, because retailers will no longer hold boxed inventory for newly released games. Trade-ins for new games disappear because a redeemed code cannot return to the counter as stock. Ordinary lending of new games disappears because account-bound licenses cannot simply be handed to another player. Private resale of new releases disappears because the digital license cannot normally be transferred after purchase. Under Sony's current model, ordinary digital purchases become fresh personal licenses, instead of existing copies moving freely between customers. PlayStation's own terms make that distinction painfully clear. Legally, a digital purchase provides a personal license for private use rather than ownership of the product itself. Closing or deleting the purchasing PlayStation account may remove access to digital content originally bought through that account. Suspension can also restrict services or access when Sony determines that platform rules have been broken. None of this means every digital game requires a permanent internet connection, and pretending otherwise would weaken the case. Installed games can work offline on an activated PlayStation 5 through console sharing and offline play. Others using that activated console can play eligible downloaded purchases, so digital household sharing has not completely vanished. Yet the system still depends on accounts activation, licenses, downloads, and infrastructure maintained by somebody else. Discs contain licenses and technical limits too, but many provide a purchase route outside the PlayStation Store. Removing that route makes the future library more dependent on Sony's continued systems, rules, and business priorities. Alongside the disc policy, PlayStation announced that its PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Vita stores will close. Selected PlayStation 3 stores in Mexico, Honduras, and Nicaragua begin closing in August 2026. Additional PlayStation 3 stores across Latin America and the Middle East begin closing late in the same year. Remaining PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Vita stores worldwide are scheduled to close in July 2027. Earlier purchases will remain downloadable for what Sony calls the foreseeable future. New content purchases stop once each store closes, immediately narrowing legal access to older digital releases. Trust our digital future, says the company while closing digital shops from its past. Downloads are not evil, and shutting old stores does not automatically prove malicious intent. Payment systems age, security standards change, older devices lose support, and maintaining legacy commerce costs money. Nevertheless, the timing demonstrates the exact weakness behind total digital dependence. Online availability survives only while contracts, servers, accounts, payment tools, and corporate priorities continue supporting it. Modern discs are not perfect preservation tools because many games need patches, extra downloads, online checks, or active servers. Some releases contain unfinished builds, while others barely hold enough data to begin installation. Even with those flaws, many physical games can still install or run after disappearing from digital storefronts. Delisted racing games provide a simple example because licensed cars, brands, and music often force digital versions from sale. Used copies may remain obtainable afterward, giving late players one legal route that a download-only release cannot provide. Without new discs, preservation becomes more dependent on redownload servers, working accounts, backward support, and unofficial community tools. Balanced criticism matters because pretending every disc contains a perfect finished archive would be dishonest. Better criticism says discs provide one imperfect preservation option, and Sony has chosen to remove that option from future releases. Speculation about PlayStation 6 also needs discipline because this policy did not announce that console. No official launch date, price, design, drive, performance target, or hardware specification appeared in Sony's notice. Rather, ending production of new PlayStation game discs after January 2028 points toward a digital-only future. Logically, future disc support now looks less likely, especially for games released after the cutoff. Technically, that remains an inference, because Sony has not revealed PlayStation 6 specifications or confirmed its hardware design. Analysts can study the date and guess at future timing, but viewers deserve clear labels whenever evidence becomes prediction. Officially, the only confirmed point is that newly released PlayStation games will no longer receive manufactured discs after the deadline. Whether older discs work on future hardware remains unanswered until Sony provides separate compatibility information. Another open question concerns collector editions, because expensive boxes could survive while containing codes instead of playable media. Imagine paying premium money for a steel case whose main feature is protecting absolutely nothing. Limited physical runs could have preserved choice without forcing Sony to manufacture huge quantities of unwanted stock. Higher physical prices could have covered manufacturing, shipping, retailer margins, and smaller production volumes. Optional drives could have remained useful if publishers were still allowed to make discs for customers willing to pay. Predictably, Sony chose this path: no resale, no lending, no use price pressure, and no physical inventory for new games. Supporters will argue that most players already prefer downloads, old stores consume resources, and discs were declining anyway. Fair enough, because the numbers prove digital gaming is the majority and denying that reality would be pointless. Majority preference, however, does not transform forced removal into a consumer service. Approximately 70 million non-digital full game units show that the remaining market was still substantial. Choice can decline naturally without a platform owner announcing the year when choice becomes forbidden. Voluntary convenience became compulsion when Sony stopped asking how customers wanted to buy future games. Currently, players can compare boxed prices, borrow copies, sell completed titles, search clearance shelves, or preserve another purchase route. Once January 2028 arrives, players lose those options for new games and receive account-bound licenses. Ultimately, this announcement is not really about plastic, shelves, manuals, or nostalgia for a spinning drive. Control is the real subject because physical copies give customers options that controlled digital distribution cannot easily monetize. Cynically, Sony used changing habits to justify erasing the habits that remained. Players chose digital because it was fast, easy, and available immediately. So would this decision change whether you buy the next PlayStation, or has convenience already won the argument for you? Whatever your answer, remember the honest verdict: digital sales won the popularity contest, and Sony used that victory to cancel the election.